Welcome today. We have a very important and I would say divergent from our message, because we are not a security organization, we're conflict resolution, but this is a day where we must talk about security, especially in the Black Sea. We are talking today about Russia and Ukraine. And I just want to remind everybody that we are the International Conflict Resolution Center, a not-for-profit, unaffiliated research center headquartered in Washington, D.C., studying the causes and current effects of so-called frozen conflicts. One of our missions, of course, also is to offer viable and measured solutions to resolving these conflicts. You can find out more at www.irccenter.org. We are on Twitter at Conflict Center. We are also on Facebook and LinkedIn. So today I want to introduce our guests. I'm going to start with General Repass first. And Major General Michael Repass retired from U.S. Army in 2013. He is currently CEO of Able Global Solutions, LLC. He is a West Point grad, of course, because that's what we have here as guests all the time. He was commander of the Combined Joint Special Operations Task Force in Operation Iraqi Freedom. He also commanded Special Operations Command in Europe. And we are glad that he has come over from our sister organization, let's just say, of Caspian Policy Center, where he is a board member. We also have, and the past guest of these videos, General Ben Hodges, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, retired from U.S. Army. He is the Pershing Chair in Strategic Studies at CEPA, which is the Center for European Policy Analysis. He has a luminary and a babackground. I don't know, more luminary than you, General Repass, or less?
Oh,
luminary?
absolutely, without
including command of United States Army forces in Western Europe and NATO land commander, and a variety of other policy analysis and legislative and other pursuits. We're so happy to have both of you gentlemen here today, given your expertise and background.
I have to interrupt. More important than any of that, you've got two native Floridians here. It's been hours.
I'm trying to get down there, to get away from the cold. It's been a cold spring in DC. Actually, it's a jumping off point to go to the Bahamas if you really want to know. But thank you, gentlemen, for being here. Just as an update, apparently the destroyers Donald Cook and Roosevelt will not be going to the Black Sea. I think the Navy notified the Turks of this last week. However, two British combat ships, anti-sub frigate and a missile destroyer, will be transiting into the Black Sea. And of course, we have the recent development of President Biden's executive order regarding the Russian Federation. That said, I'm going to go right to the point and put you both on the spot. How likely do you think within the next 2 or 3 weeks there will be some kind of armed conflict initiated by the Russians or their proxies that will bring to bear most, if not all, of these 80,000 Russian troops and warships in the Black Sea? Either of you can start, and you can actually also debate one another if you wish.
Okay, I'll start. I think conflict in the near term is unlikely, and I'll get into that here in a moment. But I think the number that you quoted is a little bit low. So they're about 40,000, slightly over 40,000 troops in Crimea, as opposed to a normal steady state of somewhat less than 20,000. They've also brought a number of combat vessels. I won't call them ships, but more like small patrol craft, heavily armored ships, etc., in from the Caspian Sea flotilla. and through the River Don and the lock system there. So they've reinforced Crimea heavily. In the case of Donbas and Luhansk, they put a large number of troops within 1 or 2 days road march to the border there. Some troops are closer, but others are farther away, about 250 kilometers or so. But generally speaking, not too far away. I would also add that they've done some other things, not only adjacent to Donbas and the Luhansk, they've done things farther north to draw attention outside the combat areas in the east. Of concern, or a potential concern to NATO, is in other areas they've reinforced troops and moved troops around. So the one that got my attention was the movement of the 56th Air Assault Brigade from the northwest up by Estonia down to the area close to Donbas and the combatant areas. So they've done a lot of movement from 4 different military districts, even from the Far East and Siberia into this region. And they aren't doing it, I would say, hastily or under the cover of darkness, so to speak. They want to be very visible about it. So it's very obvious that they're sending messages. One of the messages that they're sending with putting troops adjacent to the traditional Ukraine border is that they can strike it at the time and manner and place of their choosing. They also reinforced Kaliningrad from a brigade-sized organization to a division-sized organization, which will get the Baltic nations' attention and Poland's attention, particularly Lithuania and Poland sharing a border with Kaliningrad. All of this, in my opinion, is the information side of where they go in the period leading up to a potential conflict. They're sending definite messages. They want NATO to see what's going on. They want the world to see what's going on in places that matter to them. So that gets us to what matters to them. 2 things matter to them. One, Crimea. Their existence on Crimea seemed to be established based on facts on the ground following the 2014 essentially coup de main there. But Ukraine has cleverly made it difficult for them to exist in a regular life form in Crimea by cutting off the North Crimea Canal, which provides fresh water to the peninsula. The peninsula is not self-sustaining in that wells and other forms of water are not sufficient to sustain the number of people there, plus the 20,000 or so troops, and now 40,000 troops. So they're quickly running out of water. One might say, well, why can't you pipe in water or build desalinization plants? So the desal plants are not a capability that are found in the Russian government or in the public sector. They don't do that. So they would have to contract it out, and given the the vast sanctions regime that is on the international community, should they do business with Russia, that company that would do that would be heavily sanctioned. So in the commercial sector, there isn't an option for a desal plant, and domestically, they generally don't have the capability. It doesn't mean they can't figure it out, but it's at least 2 years away, and the need is imminent in the next month or two. So that I think is the number one concern. The number two concern is preserving Russian leverage over Ukraine's ability to do things that Russia does not agree with. This is traditionally the Russian method of rejecting foreign policy moves or even domestic moves that it does not agree with, internal to countries on its borders. it will create whatever manner of leverage it can to reject that. So specifically, escalation of either conflict or presence in the combatant areas in the east gives Russia substantial, I would say, influence and leverage in Kiev. And what do they want out of Kiev? They don't want Kiev getting closer to or joining NATO. They've come up to the precipice, so to speak, and they aren't interested in any more, I would say, closeness or NATO love. So those are the two overriding things, in my opinion, that are going on there. First, secure water to Crimea. Second, prevent Kiev from getting closer to or joining NATO. And I'll pause there for General Hodges.
General Hodges, go right ahead.
So I agree with much of what General Repass has said, as I always have. However, in this case, I believe that an escalation of kinetic operations is imminent. I mean, like in the next few days. I hope I'm wrong, but over the last couple of days, the more and more I've watched and listened and looked at what's going on, there is so much movement going on, as General Repass highlighted and described very clearly, that this seems like more than just a demonstration or muscle flexing. Now, I think it's important to provide context for all your listeners, Professor Chambers. We've been at war, or Ukraine has been at war with Russia for 7 years now, since Russia invaded Ukraine, illegally annexed and occupied Crimea, and the fighting in Donbass, in both Donetsk and Luhansk. There are thousands of Russian soldiers there, leading, backing up, supporting, enabling these so-called separatists. And this fairy tale from the Kremlin that this is somehow a civil war and we want to bring about a resolution is a complete fairy tale. And unfortunately, our friends in Berlin and Paris and London are letting them get away with it. And we haven't paid enough attention to it. The General Repass is correct that the Kremlin does not want the Donbass. They just want to keep it a mess. They want to keep it unstable so that Ukraine could never fully integrate into the European Union or NATO. I agree with him about this canal, but I think that the canal will be the pretext. I mean, the water problem is entirely of their own making, but they're using the water shortage as a pretext for a humanitarian crisis where they have to go in and do something to protect Russians, because that's part of the information effort that's underway all the time. And again, it's not because they're worried about water shortages. They could fix that very quickly. It's about getting a step closer to Odessa, because I really do think that they want to isolate Ukraine from the Black Sea, to control really from Transnistria in Moldova all the way across, and to get that last bit of Ukrainian sovereign territory on the Sea of Azov up to from the Crimea up to Mariupol, and seal that off. I mean, today was the first day where they blocked access into Sea of Azov, which is another violation of law of another agreement that they signed with Ukrainians. And so these are the kind of things that are going on. I think that the massive number of troops involved, the ships that are coming in, these vessels coming over from the Caspian. I mean, think about that. They're going to move gunboats, basically, and amphibious landing craft from the Caspian Sea through the Volga-Don Canal, then down the Don River into Azov. Not only is that hard, that's expensive. And so the investment that they're making into moving, putting all these things in place, it can't be, in my view, just for a show. They would prefer to see the Ukrainians take the bait so that then they could use that as a pretext, or they would prefer to see us make some kind of big mistake. But I think the biggest mistake we're making is a lack of decisiveness. I'm certain that the Kremlin has already figured out that the Germans and the French and probably the Brits are not going to do anything. I mean, not really. They haven't yet. And I think that they're looking at us and saying, sanctions, we could probably ride that out. The Americans are more concerned about China. And that's why I think we're in a really dangerous situation right now.
Put on your operational organizational hats, or get them out of the closet and put them back on again. And do you think that there might be a situation where the shooting will start not as some big, bold question of tactics and strategy and policy, but the everyday kind of random occurrence, Goldilocks moment where people are toe to toe and somebody makes a mistake. I mean, a lieutenant makes a mistake and everything snowballs from there? Or do you think that the forces and there's enough space there that something like that won't happen, that somebody might get the wrong message or misinterpret some item on a page and hit a button and shoot off a missile or shoot somebody on a patrol? I mean, do you think that that's how this might be started, or there might be a situation where it is a more calculated, all right, the everything, all of our ducks in a row, let's invade? I mean, where do you come down on that? Either of you. I'm just curious.
It's not my habit to disagree with General Hodges. That's a perilous venture if you want to go down that road. But I do want to throw one thing on top of his excellent analysis of the larger situation. He and I shared a document from Insight out of the Center for European Reform, and there were 2 points in there that I think bear on the problem set analytically. The author is Ian Bond, and Ian says he doesn't think that an attack from Russia is imminent based on the terrain conditions in southern Ukraine. It's too muddy right now. I just happened to watch the other night, Sunday night on TV, essentially a World at War segment where the Germans were retreating from Kursk through Ukraine in the springtime, and it was a muddy mess, and they basically didn't get out in time and suffered substantial losses as a result of that. So that would be a similar problem set, I think, that the Russians could potentially run into, although the infrastructure today is much better than it was in 1945. And then there's some other aspects of that. So I think the terrain piece argues against an imminent attack. I do agree that the movement of substantial and sophisticated weaponry into the region is no joke. It is indications of warning that bad stuff is about to happen. The one thing that is missing, if you can't get there by track vehicle or motorized vehicle, then you're going to have to get there through airborne means, air assault. So the other thing that Ian Bond points out is that the helicopters are absent from Crimea or the region that would launch a westward or northward advance by troops. So the helicopters are not present. That doesn't mean they can't rapidly get there, but they're physically not there yet. So they're perhaps a day or two away, depending on where they've been massed, but I have seen no reporting on where the helicopter formations are. So that would be, for me, a strategic indication and warning on how imminent the attack would be. Now, going directly to your question, what's the potential for either a manufactured incident or a real incident where you have somebody acting out of line with established national policy, et cetera, and starting a larger conflict? I think that the Russians would very much like for that to happen, and they will attempt to engineer it. They've removed, or civilians have departed Donbas in the line of conflict area and have been replaced by a lot of pro-Russian media types, apparently. So they're creating the conditions where they're going to create an incident and blame it on Ukraine. And they're shelling Ukrainians, Ukrainian positions, et cetera. So they're already instigating for a disproportionate Ukrainian response or a ill-advised Ukrainian response, perhaps a la Georgia 2008, where they could goad either the local commanders or the national leadership into doing something that's ill-advised. I think that possibility is very strong. and they will do it at a time and place of their choosing. And Ukraine would be well advised to show excessive restraint rather than falling for that bait. Over.
General Hodges.
So I think that, first of all, we can't think about what the Kremlin might do through Western European American eyes, and things that would seem totally illogical to us will not necessarily be illogical for them. I mean, I haven't met anybody yet that says, I told you that the Russians were going to invade Crimea after the week after Sochi. Nobody has acknowledged that. So I was completely surprised. And General Repass makes great points, of course, about the weather conditions, but that won't be a surprise to the Russians. I mean, they'll know exactly what their weather conditions are, and they'll have, if they're going to do something, they'll take that into account. And I think it won't be a big giant red arrow, which is what Lieutenant Repass and Lieutenant Hodges were expecting back in 1981, was this giant arrow sweeping across, the inter-German border. It's a very incremental. I mean, there's pressure all around, and there's probes, and I think it's until somebody really does something hard to make them stop. And I think they're counting on our incoherence. The fact that we don't even have a strategy for the Black Sea region that ties together diplomacy, information, and economic investment, as well as military capabilities. That's manifested by the fact that we've been scurrying around in DC now for weeks trying to come up with responses. What do we do about this and this? We've done nothing to take the initiative. We are constantly responding to what the Kremlin might do. That's a dead giveaway that we don't have a comprehensive strategy. That's not the Biden administration's fault. I mean, it will be in a few more weeks. They can't blame their predecessor, but there hasn't been one, I think, since I've been in the Army for that region. Now, the Navalny situation is one to keep watching. A very, very smart diplomat the other day told me, he said, if they're willing to let Navalny die in front of the entire world in their custody, then they'll absolutely invade Ukraine. I mean, that's, I think Germany probably would go crazy over Navalny dying more than they would a few thousand Russian troopers going into Ukraine. So I think this is going to be interesting to watch. I do think they're going to be very incremental in their approach. How does it start? There's been 25 Ukrainian soldiers killed in this new year during a so-called ceasefire. I mean, there was a Ukrainian soldier killed yesterday. So it won't be some knucklehead sergeant or lieutenant accidentally killing somebody and then it erupts. That's been going on. OSCE reporting about 90% of the ceasefire violations are all by the Russian side. And so now everybody's numb to it. So the fact that there's shots going off and drones getting shot down is kind of like, oh, it's just ceasefire violation. And again, I think, and Mike might challenge me on this, but I think this is part of the tactic. They get you numb by big giant exercises right on the border without living up to their own agreements about transparency. And then next thing you know, it's not an exercise. And somebody said, you don't know it's an exercise until the last day. The last two sort of indicators I would be watching, and he's right about helicopters. I mean, until you see them, of course, the fact that we don't see them right now doesn't mean that they're not there or close by. Odessa, the third largest city in Ukraine, its biggest and most important seaport. Most of the port operating companies that run the port of Odessa are Russian or Russian owned. And the former chief of the Ukrainian Navy told me he was a lot more worried about that than he was about the Black Sea Fleet. So this is a concern. And then Belarus. I had great hopes that President Lukashenko, who will never be confused with Thomas Jefferson, I had great hopes that he would at least be able to keep Russian ground troops out of Belarus. But obviously, we've all been watching that awful situation in the last many months. And now Polish officers will tell you that forces from Belarus and forces from the Russian Federation are indistinguishable in terms of being integrated and working together. So I think, and this is what General Repass alluded to a little bit earlier, things that are happening on the north side too. We're focused on where all the action is, but there's other possibilities for which we have to be alert.
Well, we'll talk about the C of A's off in a second, but I just wanted to jump into policy. What do you think first, the West, and you can define that any way you want, EU, NATO, United States should do in this crisis, long and short term? Number two, what do you think, or what do you feel President Zelensky is doing? Is he doing the right thing? I mean, is there something that he should be doing better? Should he just be interested in bilateral relations with the United States? We're still trying to convince the British, French, and Germans that his country is in peril and they need to do something about it. So it's, what should the West do generally, and then what do you think the Ukrainians should do specifically? I mean, either of you can start that off.
Okay, I'll start it off while Ben's scratching out with his crayon there. In the case of the EU, today there's a high-level meeting between the French, Germans, Russians, and Ukrainians in Paris. And there's already been an announcement coming out of that by the EU foreign minister. I actually checked that right before we came on the air. Let me see, where is it? The announcement basically said that it's a tough situation and we need to pay extra attention to what's going on here, and that the EU is they didn't use the term gravely concerned, but very concerned about what's happening. That it doesn't sound like much, but it's more engaged than the EU has been in the past. I think what it does is it really gives France and Germany an out diplomatically to have the EU take the lead in the response there, because France and Germany have their own interests that are potentially conflicting with what's going on overall. They don't want to be too aggressive against Russia, particularly with Nord Stream 2 in a vulnerable position now in Germany, and Merkel's perceived, if not actual, support for Russia overall. But having the EU out there in front gives them, I won't say plausible deniability, it just gives them a foil to hold the conflict at a distance. So I don't think we'll see much out of the EU. That's just my personal opinion.
Colonel Hodges.
Well, I was going to finish up with some other points. I actually had some other points.
Oh, sorry.
The good stuff's coming out.
Yes, I got my glasses on now, so I can read my notes. So I thought something like this might come up. I thought it was interesting that President Biden, in his phone call a few days ago, was followed up by Secretary Blinken, Security Advisor, National Security Advisor Sullivan, SecDef Austin, and Chairman of Joint Chiefs General Milley. All those guys made phone calls there. So to have the U.S., I would say, ring the bell at the top tier of security-related engagement is a significant gain for Russia prestige-wise. He wants attention, so he's got the attention of the U.S. that he wants. Now, what was in the context of what was said by the others, but in the case of the principal, the president, he pledged unwavering support for Ukraine, unwavering support. He didn't say, I'm going to actively support, I will not put up with, it's more important to note what he did not say. Under the Obama administration, when Ukraine was initially invaded, we provided Humvees, blankets, and MREs. Under the Trump administration, lethal aid was provided. And under the Biden administration, they're continuing on with additional aid to include improved command and control, counter battery radars, increased lethality, situational awareness, and intel sharing. So that's all important, but I didn't hear anything about, combat troops or real capabilities that are going to either deny Russian penetration into Ukrainian terrain or counter Russian presence on Ukrainian terrain. So that commitment's not out there, and I think it would be unwise to provide that prior to an actual Russian invasion. I just don't see it happening. So that's kind of my assessment on what has been done. Now, what should be done? I think the nations of the West, primarily France, UK, and Germany, are the most capable, should loudly signal that changing the political boundaries of a European landmass country will not be tolerated and will not be accepted. To the extent they'll do that, I think that's probably a pie in the sky wish. The United States could also strongly signal that they would not support that as well. General Hodges alluded to in his prior comments about the larger Black Sea region that has a vested interest in this, particularly Moldova and Romania and Bulgaria. Bulgaria, we know, is undermined by Russian subterfuge, so to speak. Their economy has been controlled by the Russians. Hungary also has an interest in that region as well. So the greater Black Sea, to include the Turks, have a very strong interest in what happens in Ukraine. And they should be engaged and clearly send a unified signal that any expansion by Russia by the force of arms will not be accepted. And I'll pause there for General Hodges.
So what he said, what General Repass said should happen is exactly right. That's what should be happening, but unfortunately it hasn't happened. Other than some EU sanctions, the EU really has been a colossal disappointment. And when Mr. Borrell went to Moscow, you remember about a month and a half ago, and he was humiliated by Lavrov in front of the whole world. And just showed that the Kremlin has absolutely zero respect for the EU as a force, if you will, because they know that German and French business drive everything, and neither of those countries seem willing to risk it. I mean, I haven't heard much in the last many weeks out of Berlin saying, okay, this is enough. Even for us, this is too much, and we're going to terminate, or we're going to suspend the Nord Stream 2 project. Zip, nothing. So there was a meme going around today on Twitter referencing what Mike just said about the EU said, very concerned. And so the meme was, EU has elevated the concern level from concerned to very concerned. I mean, just, because there's nothing to it. And that's the disappointing part. But I can't be too frustrated because honestly, the Trump administration came across as extremely weak on the Kremlin. Now, U.S. forces in Europe did increase during the past administration. That matters, but giving javelins is not a strategy. That's a capability, but that's not a strategy. And so I think that we've got a lot of work that we have to do here. I agree completely with General Repass that Turkey has such an important role here. And if we had a Black Sea regional strategy where the Black Sea was up in the middle of the map, not at the bottom right-hand corner, it would change how we think about the region. Economically, the area that Professor Chambers, you have so much expertise and knowledge in, the South Caucasus should be the 8-lane highway for traffic, commercial traffic, the economic corridor between Eurasia and Europe, which is exactly why the Russians have done everything they could to make sure that they're the ones sitting there now with peacekeepers in Azerbaijan. They never got rid of their Cold War bases in Armenia. And obviously, they have no intention of leaving their illegally occupied territory in Georgia 13 years after they said they would. So the only corridor between Europe and Eurasia that didn't go through Russia or Iran now has Russian troops all over it. And so this is because we didn't compete there. We've had great ambassadors, but they never had a strategy that they could hook into, that where we could have policies that made sense, and where we've invested tons of money into infrastructure, for example. The last thing that the Kremlin wants is a lot of European companies setting up shop in Georgia, where it would be this logistics hub, because then the Bundestag and the French Parliament or the National Assembly and everybody else would be paying attention to what's going on in Georgia. They don't want that. And of course, Romania would be a huge beneficiary. Everybody on the Danube River would benefit if the Caucasus did in fact become this portal, because then all that traffic would be bypassing Russia and headed straight to Constanta or out through the Turkish Straits. We have got to fix our relationship with Turkey. I lived in Izmir for 2 years. General Repass came and inspected my headquarters when I was there. It's an incredible country and history and culture, but God Almighty, they're the most frustrating ally we have. We have to have them. And we got to think long term. You know, regimes change, but the geography doesn't change. And we've got to figure out how to rebuild trust with the Turks. We can't let the S-400 issue be the defining issue for our relationship. Otherwise, Russia they just pick us apart, and they do and take what they want, and because they know that we're not prepared to really respond. Last point, I was watching BBC earlier today during the middle of the day news, their leading news show. The first 8 minutes, all they could talk about was this new soccer league, a breakaway league for European football, that's telling the UEFA, hey, we got something better to do. That's the first 8 minutes. And then it was minute 10 when they finally mentioned Navalny. Zip about any of this, what we've been talking about for the last 44 minutes. Maybe we're crazy, I don't know, but it's not on the front page in London.
Well, let me ask you, getting back to Ukraine specifically and President Zelensky, do you think that something provocative has to happen, like say on the Sea of Azov, if Mariupol falls, let's say whatever definition you have of falling, that will prompt action in Berlin, Paris, London, and Washington? Let's take Berlin and Paris first. I mean, if the Sea of Azov, and I think General Hodges, I mean, we talked about the analogy of the Canadians shutting down the St. Lawrence Seaway. I mean, that would probably get people's attention pretty quickly. Unlikely, but I mean, the analogy's there. I mean, do you think that something like that, with Mariupol falling, with the Sea of Azov utterly cut off, that would jar something in the West, or is this incrementalism now frozen into everybody's thinking?
I'll go first because I've been copying Mike's answers for the last 3 questions, so I'll go this time. Honestly, I hate to say it, but I think if Mariupol fell, that whole piece of the Azov coastline, there'd be people shaking their fists, and it would be very, very concerned, and that might trigger a couple of other things. But honestly, I don't think that'll do the trick. With Berlin or Paris. I think they see Azov. I mean, Azov is not considered international waters. That's an internal body of water agreed upon between Ukraine and Russia. Nobody shed a tear, frankly, outside of Ukraine when the Russians built that giant bridge there, which any second lieutenant could say, that's a gate, that's blockade. And now Russia announcing that they're stopping all shipping from going in there. Nobody around here said anything about that. So I don't think that will be, that's the kind of thing that I think sort of gets absorbed, especially because it probably happens in sort of a ooze creeping kind of way. Obviously, I hope I'm totally wrong, but I don't think that'll do it.
General Repass?
Yeah, so I agree with General Hodges on this. And I would say that, the way you frame the question is, how do we get Paris, London, and Berlin to care about Mariupol? That's Zelensky's #1 strategic communication challenge right there, is he has to make that matter to them. Let's say he's successful. I think he's going to be challenged to get Portugal and Denmark interested in anything that's going on in Mariupol. So even if you get the big 3 plus the U.S. engaged and concerned about it, you've got the other members of NATO and the other members of the EU saying, so what's Mariupol to me? So Zelensky has to definitely make the case for why Mariupol, and in the larger point, going back to General Hodges' strategic point, I would say regionally strategic point, is why Odessa matters to Europe. And until Zelensky successful, or his people successfully make those points to the EU, NATO, and the United States, being an exception to the EU and Canada, until he makes it those points rapidly and presciently clear, I think he's going to have a challenge on his hand. The Russians are going to have their way at the time and manner of their choosing. Over.
What do you see as not an end game, but I mean, do you feel that a perpetual state of use General Hodges' term of mess and indecisiveness in Ukraine is that the end game here? I mean, if does Zelensky just have to say, okay, we're never going to try to join NATO, and we're going to leave the EU alone, and then all of a sudden those troops leave? Or is, I mean, what do you think that the end game here is, aside from sowing confusion and keeping this Zelensky and a sovereign country, Ukraine, off balance? I mean, there's got to be some kind of tangible end game here, doesn't there? And either of you can take that.
Yeah, I think the general staff, if I was the planner on the general staff laying out the campaign plan, and of course you'd be laying out what are our strategic objectives. There's 5 or 6 things that come to mind, but I'm just going to touch 3. Number one, Ukraine never able to integrate into the EU or NATO. And you achieve that by maintaining this instability in Donbass, hanging on to Crimea, so that Germans and French specifically will never be willing to agree to something which would require them to have to fight for Ukraine. That's what we're talking about, Article 5.
Right.
And you'd have a hard time filling up a Deuce-and-a-half truck with Germans that will be willing to do that right now. And this is not a courage thing. This is about zero interest.
Right.
So them making sure that Ukraine, and by the way, that's the same goal, of course, for Georgia and Moldova, as Mike talked about specifically with Transnistria, maintaining this sort of buffer of instability all around Russia. In state number 2 is that his elections in September is a resounding victory, that even if you take off 20% for normal cheating, that everybody would agree, like, okay, he was reelected. So he's got a serious domestic challenge, because life is so bad in Russia right now, especially outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg, that he's got to distract. And this is classic of what's going on right now. And then the third end state and I'll stop after this, is, of course, he fears NATO more than anything. I mean, he absolutely hates NATO and everything it stands for. And so wherever he can exploit cracks and seams, whether it's through disinformation, economic leverage, threats, all of these things to create dissension and lack of trust between allies, that's an end state for him that he'll spare at no cost.
Any follow-up, General Repass?
No, it's absolutely spot on, and I absolutely agree with everything there. So the domestic situation, I think, is potentially close to number 1, and then the NATO piece should fall out of that. As long as Putin's around, there will be no Ukraine in NATO, and he's going to make sure of that. In creating wedge issues, he's a master at it, and he's done a very good job at it from his perspective. And I can see that absolutely being the case. I think the piece that some people have glommed onto that is often misinterpreted, that was not wrongly explained by General Hodges. In fact, was better explained, is this piece of keeping instability on the margins of Russia. What people frequently default to is that, well, he wants to restore the Russian, dynasty, so to speak, where he controlled all of Eastern Europe, to include the motherland itself. I think that's an overstatement of Russian imperial goals. I think what they want is they want to retain the instability on its borders, so that they either have a direct or indirect veto over what happens on its borders, therefore creating by default the buffer that it seeks from the primary adversary being NATO. So that would be my view of the regional situation.
Well, just to give you some context to my question, do you think that President Zelensky is the type of person, whatever you know about him, his administration, his advisors, the legislative arm there, branch of government, even opposition, who would basically reverse bait them into attacking him, and thus forcing the situation, from incrementalism to, okay, let's see what you got, and then hoping that the United States will come in and help. We had a situation when we were in Azerbaijan where there were several people in the Azeri government who thought that the reverse was going on with Armenia, that Armenia was trying to obviously provoke them into attacking them and having Russia come in and helping. Do you think that Zelensky is the type of person that would take that same track and basically say, okay, we can't have this incrementalism forever. Let's see what you got, and basically try to draw these powers in to help them? I mean, do you see that as a scenario, or is that just something theoretical?
Yeah, I'll jump on that one first. I'm not one to prematurely rule out any level of incompetence or bad ideas by any government, to include our own. But that would be an exceedingly bad idea, because it would absolutely be found out in due course, and it would
Right.
corrupt the discussion, where Ukraine is clearly the oppressed at the moment, and any international will that exists to help them out at any level would quickly evaporate.
Right.
If it turned out that Ukraine had conspired internally to create the circumstances where they goaded Russia into attacking them so that the world would come to their assistance. But I would have to say one thing: we the West, in this discussion, and even in the fight on the ground, we can't want it worse than them. So the Ukrainians have a lot of work to do to get out of their own way. What I mean by that is they need to do some bureaucratic reform inside the Ministry of Defense. The whole security sector needs reform. They're pretty good at the tactical level, but it's ossified at the upper ranks, and they're working on that, but they aren't reforming fast enough. I mean, we've been steadily engaged with those guys for 5 years or more now at the senior level, and they've been somewhat resistant to the Western help that's been abundantly provided to them. So they got to stand up and help themselves and put their big boy pants on at some point in time. And I agree that they need help with unique capabilities and niche capabilities that they can't organically produce or field. But they do have a challenge internally that they need to do some reforms, and perhaps this now apparent Russian threat that is imminent or perhaps delayed a few months is the way that President Zelensky can reform his government, and the ministers could use that as leverage, saying we aren't moving fast enough. We're not proactive, as General Hodges pointed out. We're not proactive. We're reacting. So they've got to get their act together internally to make them more efficient and more capable of defending their borders. And we can't want it worse than them. Over.
General, go ahead.
Yeah, think I like the old Rahm Emanuel thing, never let a crisis go to waste. Uh, now is an opportunity for President Zelensky and supporters to include the United States and others to say, okay, yeah, we're going to deal with this with Russia, but we've got to fix some things internal. I mean, societal resilience is just as important as having a crackerjack navy or top shelf air defense systems. And Ukrainian people deserve to have government that is transparent. I've been working with some members of the Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, to help encourage the Ministry of Defense to allow transparency of the defense budget. I mean, right now, the Rada basically is a rubber stamp, the parliament, over a gigantic budget. And of course, the corruption inside what's called Ukro-Boronprom, the defense industry, is legendary, as well as inefficient. And so getting, like in our Constitution, Article 1, Section 8 gives the Congress all those powers. I think that's what needs to happen in Ukraine. And of course, MOD hates the idea of having to now explain where all the money has gone. But if you don't do it now, it's not going to happen. I think that the President Zelensky deserves a great deal of credit. The Ukrainians have not taken the bait, the so-called Saakashvili trap that Mike referenced earlier. Ukrainian soldiers have been very disciplined. I mean, they've been sitting there in these stinking trenches for years with Russian violations all over the place with no end in sight, and it's impressive to me, and which is why I'm so motivated for us to want to support them. But you remember, Ukraine, that's where the Soviet Union, that was the heart of the Soviet defense industry, was Ukraine. So it's not like they don't know how to make great anti-tank systems. I visited the tank plant in Kharkiv back a few years ago when I was still in the Army. And I mean, I'm a history nerd. This was the birthplace of the T-34 tank, the most famous tank in history.
Right.
They're still proud of that thing. And I mean, walking around in there, I can guarantee you OSHA has never been inside that place. I mean, there was people smoking cigarettes and all that, but it was impressive. And they were doing battle damage repair on tanks. And then I saw a whole line of new tanks lined up. And I said, are those going to the front? Are those going? And they said, no, these are going to Thailand. I said, what? You're humping the leg of the president of the United States to give you javelin, and you're exporting tanks? I mean, really good tanks. And it was a matter of, inside stuff. Let me shut up by saying that the United States has got to have a strategy for the region. This is about great power competition, and Ukraine should be the keystone of our Black Sea regional approach. Romania, center of gravity. They're a terrific ally. We've got great capability already at MK, Mikhail Goganol-Chanu Air Base there. Our great Air Force has just deployed a squadron of MQ-9 Reapers that are operating out of Campiotârzi Air Base in Romania. That's the place. Fix our relationship with Turkey, invest in Georgia, get Georgia on in NATO now, and don't talk about NATO with Ukraine so much. That's only pouring gas on the fire. But make it clear that we're going to do everything up to and just short of membership until we get the Germans and the French to go along with it. So that's of course, the administration doesn't have assistant secretaries. We don't have ambassadors. All these positions are not yet filled. So they're having to fight without a full team yet.
Let me ask both of you, piggybacking on the last thing you said, General Hodges, what are the specific economic moves, given what you guys are doing now, either think tank work or private sector work, what are the economic moves that the Biden administration, and in conjunction with the U.S. Congress, can do to help engineer that component of this kind of great power game? Because there has to be that component. There has to be, again, an end around Russia to provide the Germans and the French, their natural gas and their wheat for their bread and everything. Where do you see that coming from? That kind of impetus. Allies in it, of course, Azerbaijan with natural gas and oil as well, looking for people to sell it to. What do you think the administration can do to generate that with the private sector in the United States to provide that push that maybe the Germans and the French aren't doing in the Caucasus, and as I said, to end around this monolith that's sitting up there that doesn't want an end around it. It wants everything coming through it. Either of you, if you have any thoughts on that.
I'll throw a couple of softballs out there. The obvious ones are energy diversification. They got to get off the Russian gas some kind of way. And you already hit on it, Dr. Chambers, the getting a reliable supply of gas from Azerbaijan or the Trans-Caspian gas pipeline system, having something up to Ukraine. I would say it's probably a bad bet to have it coming under the Black Sea, but they just finished the other pipeline there. Perhaps there can be a trunk that would eventually go through Romania and up into Ukraine. So energy diversification to offset Russian coercion in the energy sector. That would stabilize the economy and help out. The point that General Hodges made about the defense industry is can also be made on agriculture and some of the other industries as well. Just bureaucratic ineptitude and corruption are sucking potential lifeblood out of the economy. So there needs to be a reform across the board, economic reform. So that's a rather large discussion, but I'll leave it at that. I'm sure General Hodges has some better ideas than me. Over.
Yeah, General, I mean, just piggybacking off of what you had said before about developing these regions, do you have any other insights or any more specific comments about that?
Well, General Repass, he knows I have no better ideas than him, but I want to add on to it or reinforce what he's saying. Economic investment for me is like the third leg of a three-legged stool, and the other two are military and in terms of American power, diplomatic power, military power, and economic power. And so figuring out how do we get American business investing into Georgia, into Romania, into Ukraine? How do we come up with agreements that get European countries wanting to go along? The 3 Cs initiative is a good example of a good idea. It's a framework for improving vertical infrastructure it's called 3 Cs because it's, of course, the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, and the Adriatic Sea. And the idea was to get off of Russian gas, to get energy infrastructure going north-south and transportation infrastructure. I mean, I'm a big believer in, Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. If you build highways and ports in the right places, business moves to it for obvious reasons. But it turns out, in Romania, I was just in Bucharest all last week, so I got Romania on the brain right now. And the port of Constanta, that place should be humming. It's operating at less than 25% capacity because there's nothing coming out of Georgia. And the Danube is good only for our grandparents on river cruises because there's no real profit incentive to dredge it and maintain it the way the Rhine River is like the Autobahn here. Danube, not so much. And so they've got the idea to have a highway project that connects Constanta to Gdansk in Poland. What do you think the biggest opponent of this is? The Dutch, Rotterdam. Right. The last thing they want are other ports competing with what comes through Rotterdam. So and also the Dutch, by the way, are great allies, but there's no way they'll agree to let Romania or Bulgaria become part of the Schengen. Again, because of this economic competition. So this is where the United States has got to really step up and say, fellas, listen, this is for everybody's going to get rich here, but we have got to work together. We have got to compete. And 3Cs initiative is one way to do it. One of the best accomplishments by the previous administration was the creation, with huge congressional support, bipartisan support, of the Development Finance Corporation. It's a government agency that is able to put a lot of money into investment in places that are not necessarily third world, let's say.
Right.
So places like Georgia, ideal for DFC investment. And I hope that the new administration will look at that the same way.
Gentlemen, let's move on to just kind of wrapping up and giving each of you the last word. And again, you don't necessarily have to agree with one another. Here's a situation where conflict is good and entertaining. Give me a last word as to what you see, materializing over the next couple of weeks into the summer, and feel free to challenge each other. General Repass, let's start with you.
I think that Russia will continue to escalate, and that the EU political engagement will be ineffective in de-escalating the situation. Specifically, I think Russia will pour regular forces into the combatant areas in the east. They'll improve their capabilities in Crimea, and I think they'll demonstrate that they have a reasonable, if not pretty darn good, flotilla capable of blocking the Black Sea, or Ukraine's use of the Black Sea in contesting Odessa. I think that all that will be demonstrations to coerce President Zelensky, short of open warfare, to give Russia what it wants. First would be water into Crimea via the North Crimea Canal, and then some type of solemn pledge not to join NATO, which will take a actual law to be passed into Rada. Maybe there'll be a declaration on that, but that's what Russia wants to see happen. If Ukraine agreed to that, Zelensky would be thrown out of office in minutes. So they are miles apart on anything that they can agree to. Therefore, I think escalation will result in potentially low-level combat, a push on to Mariupol, if not on the reaches of the North Crimea Canal that runs 250 miles up to the Dnipro River, potentially going after the key nodes along that to open up the locks. That'd be my guess. And timing on that, I would say late June, perhaps. Over.
So I had the chance to speak to a former member of the Rada who's from the region that Mike just talked about, the Kherson region, which kind of west of where the canal is. And I said, what's the population sentiment there? And he said 60-40 pro-Ukraine. So in terms of local officials, the average person, slightly more than half are pro-Ukraine, pro-Kyiv, but 40%-ish are pro-Russia. So this is a very vulnerable population. And I think it won't just be Russian Marines or paratroopers descending there. I think if they were to do something, this would all be part of it. And can you imagine a terrible situation where humanitarian crisis, and now you've got sympathetic Ukrainians that live in the area start trying to open the canal, and you've got Cossacks start showing up, and then you've got Ukrainian police and military kicking the shit out of Ukrainians over water for Ukrainians. I mean, that seems far-fetched, but I mean, that's exactly the witch's brew that the Kremlin specializes in. And it confuses everybody. There's no obvious bad guy, and the ooze just keeps seeping in. So that's the kind of thing, which is why I think strong leadership by President Zelensky, with absolutely super crystal clear, unequivocal commitment by the United States. And what the president said was important. The sovereignty of Ukraine and its territorial integrity is a priority for the United States. I mean, That's not like, hey, we're pulling for you. I mean, that's a policy statement. And we just got to get the strategy to underpin it with strategy. Then you get priorities, and then you get resources. And I think about our great Navy. I mean, nothing like it in the history of the world. Our great Navy. It's probably about half the size it needs to be for all the stuff it's constantly asked to do. I think the decision that these two ships were turned around, that would not have been a Navy decision, obviously. I mean, that's a much higher level. Probably, I wish I knew. So this is going to be Ben Hodges of infantry guessing here. But I think they were turned around because people really believed that the Russians were ready to, would in fact take a shot or would do something. You know, a at-sea collision, that they've been demonstrating very unprofessional conduct over the past few years, that it would be something much closer that could lead to something. And I think they probably said, this is not the time to do that. Unfortunately, the STRATCOMs, we fumbled in our own end zone with that, because it looks like we're coming, the Russians flex, and we turn around and go back. I mean, that's what it looks like to the average observer. That's not what's happening, but that's what it looks like. And so if you have a strategy with a priority, then instead of having the occasional U.S. Navy ship that goes up in there, you're maxing out what's allowed within Montreux. I mean, there's a constant presence, so it's not a big deal to get a ship there because they're always there within the constraints of Montreux, or the Royal Navy, or the Germans. Something that's why when you don't have a strategy, you end up having to try and patch it up at the worst time.
Well, we'll leave that last sentence as the last word, as prophetic and as it might be if you don't have a strategy. Gentlemen, thank you so much, General Michael Repass, General Ben Hodges. Again, this video will be posted fairly soon on YouTube and available on our website. We hope it will be used for reference and the insights given. And I thank you today, and we'll check back maybe midsummer and see what's going on. There's a very good possibility our staff might be going over to Ukraine and kind of, you know, get our ankles into it right there. So, gentlemen, thank you. Appreciate it, and have a great day. And we hope to have you back again very soon. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure. And if the United States is sending Dr. Chambers to Ukraine, that means we're getting serious.
Hopefully. We'll see.
All right. Mike, great seeing you, man.
Good to see you, and good luck over there. I hope to see you in person soon.
Okay, bro.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Bye-bye.